It was just a string of lights. Soft, warm, barely brighter than the moonlight that skimmed the surface of my dock. I'd installed them myself, golden LED strips along the railings of my boat, outlining the frame with a soft glow. It wasn't for show. It was for safety. My wife, Emily, liked to sit with me on the water after dark, and the lights made it easier for her to climb in and out. Her vision had never been great at night, and after her knee surgery, steps were tricky. The lights helped. That's all. They made our nights by the lake feel a little more magical, a little more peaceful. Until someone decided peace was a violation. The letter came folded tight in a plain white envelope, wedged between the electric bill and a grocery store flyer. At first, I thought it was junk mail. Then I saw the HOA header and my stomach clenched. The last time they wrote, it was because our front hedge exceeded the maximum height by 3.2 inches. This time, the accusation was bigger and colder. Unauthorized lighting installation in violation of HOA Covenant Article 6, subsection B. Below it, the penalty, $10,000. Not a warning. Not a notice to remove. A fine. $10,000. For lights on my boat. I sat at the kitchen table for an hour, staring at the paper like it might change its mind if I looked long enough. Emily walked in with 2 mugs of coffee and paused when she saw the look on my face. I showed her the letter, and for a moment, she didn't say a word. Then she let out a bitter little laugh. "They're insane," she said. "That's criminal." But it wasn't criminal, not technically. It was within the scope of HOA enforcement, as they liked to remind us. I'd read those bylaws when we moved in. All 67 pages of them. And while I never saw anything that forbade decorative lighting, I knew what this was. It wasn't about the lights. It was about control. Our HOA president, Sylvia Hartman, had always had a thing about the dock. She treated the lake like her personal kingdom. Claimed she'd designed the community shoreline herself, even though the lake had been there long before she bought her overpriced lakeside home. Every summer, she gave speeches about preserving the aesthetic, and she'd spent thousands of HOA dollars installing hideous solar-powered lamps that barely worked. The irony wasn't lost on me. My lights were clean, quiet, barely visible from shore unless you looked. Hers blinked and flickered like dying fireflies. But of course, hers were approved. Mine were an unauthorized alteration. I called the HOA office, hoping to speak with someone reasonable. Instead, I got a voicemail that routed me straight to Sylvia. I left a polite message asking for clarification, suggesting we meet to discuss it. No response. I emailed. Nothing. I waited 3 days, then 5. On the 6th day, I received another letter, this one stating that failure to pay would result in escalation to legal collections. Emily said we should just remove the lights. "It's not worth it," she told me. But I shook my head. "That's the point," I replied. "If we let them do this, what's next? A fee for wind chimes? A penalty for planting tulips?" She didn't argue. She knew I was right. I drove to the HOA office in person. It sat at the edge of the neighborhood in a little brick building that looked more like a bank than a community center. The receptionist gave me a tight smile when I explained why I was there, then disappeared behind a door labeled "Staff Only." 10 minutes later, Sylvia walked out, clipboard in hand, lips painted the color of fresh blood. "Mr. Callahan," she said, like she was greeting a disappointing student. "Your lights are in clear violation." I tried to explain about Emily, about the safety concerns, but she cut me off. "The rules are not subjective. You agreed to them when you signed your residency agreement." Her voice was cold. "Practiced. If everyone did what they wanted with their boats, the lake would look like a carnival." I looked at her, really looked at her, this woman who had never so much as smiled at a neighbor, who patrolled the shoreline like a sheriff from some dystopian suburbia, and I realized something: she didn't care about lights. She cared about power. About reminding us that we didn't really own our homes, not completely. Not as long as she had her clipboard and the authority of a bylaw. I walked out of that office without another word. But something inside me had shifted. This wasn't just about $10,000 anymore. This was about boundaries. Not the kind you mark with fences, but the kind you draw in your heart, the line between dignity and submission. Sylvia had crossed mine. And I was done being polite. I didn't sleep that night. I sat out on the porch with a notebook and a thermos of coffee, staring at the dock and the little boat tied to it, its soft golden lights twinkling like fireflies on still water. I didn't see a violation. I saw my peace. I saw the last 5 years of quiet nights with Emily, of conversations that healed our tired hearts after long days, of gentle fishing trips and starlit memories. And now, that peace had a price tag. $10,000. I could have paid it, I had the money, but it wasn't about that anymore. It was about standing tall. About not letting petty tyrants like Sylvia build their kingdom on my silence. The next morning, I called Monica. She was more than a friend, she was the lawyer who helped me win the lake battle last year. When I told her what had happened, she didn't even sound surprised. HOA boards are like weeds, she said. Pull one, 2 more grow back stronger. But this is different. They've overstepped. I asked her what my options were, and she promised to dig into the bylaws again, line by line. And in the meantime, she added, don't pay a cent. I took her advice. I also documented everything. I photographed the lights from every angle. I recorded a walkthrough of the boat. I pulled up the security footage that showed exactly how little the lights actually affected anything beyond the dock. I printed copies of emails, letters, and the voicemail I'd left for Sylvia. Every scrap of it went into a folder labeled Dock Dispute. I wasn't just preparing for a rebuttal, I was preparing for war. Then came the second letter. This one wasn't just a demand for payment. It came with photos. Not mine, theirs. Grainy surveillance-style shots taken from across the lake. Someone had used a zoom lens from the other side, capturing me and Emily as we boarded the boat one evening. It felt invasive. Predatory. There was even a timestamp, like they were building a case file against us. I showed the letter to Emily, and I saw her face go pale. They're watching us, she whispered. What is wrong with them? That night, I drove the entire shoreline, looking for hidden cameras, signs, anything that might explain the photos. And that's when I saw it, tucked between the cattails near Sylvia's private dock, half buried in brush, was a small pole with a motion sensor and a mounted camcorder. I yanked it free, took photos, and bagged it. The next morning, I handed it all to Monica. Now we've got them for unlawful surveillance, she said, her voice grim with determination. You want to play offense this time? I nodded. And that's when it hit me. All this energy, all this intrusion, all this effort, just to punish me for lights on a boat. But what about their own dock? Sylvia was obsessed with compliance, but her dock was wired with lighting so bright it looked like an airport runway after dark. And I knew something she didn't. The electrical lines that powered her dock and several others ran through a utility box located, legally, on my land. Years ago, the original developer had asked my permission to run underground cables through the corner of my lot. I'd agreed, back when people were neighbors instead of rule enforcers. And now, those lines fed her lights, her power outlets, and the decorative fountain that she used as her backyard centerpiece. I didn't rush it. I pulled the blueprints, confirmed everything, had an electrician verify the setup. It was all legit, but not permanent. My agreement had been verbal, never codified in any legal easement or contract. And more importantly, I still controlled the box. So I filed a request with the county to review the installation. It passed. Then I drafted a formal letter to the HOA board, informing them that I would be disconnecting the utility lines crossing my property due to non-consensual usage and retaliation. I gave them 7 days' notice. The silence that followed was louder than any siren. No one responded. No phone calls. No meetings. Sylvia didn't even show up to the usual Saturday patrol. But I could feel the tension in the air. The neighbors who once nodded politely now stared, uncertain whose side they were supposed to be on. I didn't blame them. It wasn't their fight. Yet. On the 8th day, I did it. I shut it down. With one twist of a key, I cut the line that powered their entire shoreline dock, Sylvia's included. The lights blinked once, then died. The little fountain sputtered and stopped. Her precious backyard showcase was plunged into quiet, moonlit darkness. And for the first time in weeks, I smiled. The news traveled faster than wildfire. By morning, Sylvia had called an emergency board meeting, and by afternoon, the neighborhood group chat was on fire. Some messages were angry. Others were confused. A few were supportive. He had every right, one neighbor wrote. We've all had enough of her power games. Someone else posted a photo of Sylvia standing on her now dark dock, arms crossed, phone in hand, likely calling every county office within reach. Emily read the thread out loud while we sat on the porch, her voice trembling with something between disbelief and laughter. You've officially made her snap, she whispered, squeezing my hand. But I wasn't laughing. Not because I regretted it, I didn't, but because I knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The next day, I received a visit, not from Sylvia, but from a board member named James, a younger guy who had always seemed like a puppet in HOA politics but who, until now, had never looked me in the eye. Can we talk? He asked awkwardly, glancing at the porch camera. I nodded and stepped outside. He explained that the board was under a lot of pressure, and that Sylvia was taking things personally, which was his way of admitting the entire boat light thing had spun way out of control. Look, he said, I don't agree with how this was handled, but shutting off the dock power affects everyone. Maybe we can find a compromise. I stared at him for a long moment. James, when you say compromise, do you mean I pay $10,000 for lights that you know were never a problem? Or do you mean the board admits it messed up and retracts the fine? He shifted uncomfortably. I mean, maybe something in between. I shook my head. I've already paid more than 10 grand in time, stress, and privacy violations. I'm not giving them another cent. But I'll make you a deal, public apology, letterhead, signed by the board, and they acknowledge that their actions were retaliatory. Do that, and I'll restore the power. He looked stunned. You want them to admit fault? I want them to be human, I replied. And I want them to stop acting like they own us. He left without giving me an answer. But his silence said enough. Sylvia would never sign a letter like that. Not in a million years. And so, the standoff continued. A week later, a notice appeared on the community bulletin board, dock restoration plan pending legal review. That was code for, we're threatening to sue the guy who owns the land our wires run through. But Monica was already ahead of them. She sent a certified letter to the HOA's legal rep, clearly stating that any attempt to force reconnection would constitute trespassing and could trigger counter-litigation. She also included documentation of the surveillance camera Sylvia had planted on my shoreline, still in my possession, and hinted at the privacy lawsuit we were preparing. In short, if they wanted war, they'd have to bring more than threats. Still, Sylvia wouldn't back down. She posted a scathing email to the entire community, painting me as disruptive, non-compliant, and vindictive. She claimed I was endangering residents by cutting off access to critical shoreline safety lighting. I responded with a photo of my fully functional, softly glowing boat, powered entirely by a self-contained battery. My wife's safety lights were a violation, I wrote, but your dock lights are critical? Make it make sense. The email exploded. Neighbors began replying. Some cautiously. Others bluntly. Someone named Maria wrote, "This is getting ridiculous. Why are we paying dues to be bullied?" Another replied, "Because we're afraid to speak up." Until now. That reply stopped me cold. Until now. Those two words rang in my ears long after the thread died down. People had been living under Sylvia's thumb for years, just like I had, afraid to speak, afraid to push back. And all it took was one person saying no. Not with fists. Not with rage. But with calm defiance. With truth. With a key turning in a utility box and a voice saying, "That's enough." It was never about the lights. It was always about control. And now, the control was slipping. The strange thing about taking a stand is how quiet it gets after the noise. Once the arguments die down, once the emails stop and the gossip retreats behind closed blinds, you're left alone with your choices. And I stood by mine. I didn't flinch, even as some neighbors avoided eye contact or walked their dogs on the far side of the road. But there were just as many who stopped me in passing, nodding with unspoken gratitude, dropping off homemade pies or handwritten notes that simply said, "Thank you." I kept them all. Every one. Because they reminded me that doing the right thing rarely feels easy, but it always echoes in ways we can't predict. Emily and I settled back into our routines. We spent more time on the water. She'd sit at the bow of the boat, a blanket around her legs, that soft golden glow illuminating her gentle smile. It was still our sanctuary, even with the storm outside. But we both knew Sylvia wouldn't let things go. That woman didn't know how to lose quietly. And sure enough, 2 weeks after I cut the dock power, she came in person. I heard the knock, 3 sharp raps like a judge's gavel, and opened the door to see her standing on the porch, arms crossed, wearing a teal power suit like armor. She didn't wait for an invitation. "This has gone far enough," she said. I let her talk. She accused me of sabotage, of selfishness, of putting the entire community at risk. She said I had weaponized my property and set a dangerous precedent. I watched her closely as she spoke, not just the words, but the desperation underneath them. This wasn't about a dock or lights. It was about her losing control of the one thing that gave her purpose. Sylvia had built her identity around being the HOA president. Around enforcing rules and commanding compliance. And now someone had said no, and worse, others were starting to agree with him. That terrified her. When she finally stopped, I asked one question. "Sylvia, why didn't you just talk to me before sending the fine?" She blinked. "Just once." "Because rules are rules," she said, her voice quieter. I nodded slowly. "And that's why they've lost all meaning. When you forget that people are behind the rules, you turn them into weapons." She didn't respond. She just turned and left, walking stiffly down my driveway, her heels crunching the gravel like distant gunfire. I didn't expect her to apologize. But for the first time, I saw the cracks in her armor. The next board meeting was packed. Dozens of neighbors came, many for the first time in years. Monica came too, sitting beside me, calm and ready. Sylvia stood at the front with her usual clipboard, but her voice trembled slightly as she opened the meeting. People started asking questions. Real ones. Tough ones. About where their dues were going. About why fines were being issued without hearings. About how decisions were being made without community input. I didn't speak at first. I didn't need to. The room was doing it for me. But then someone stood up, a woman named Karen, who lived on the opposite side of the lake. She held a folder in her hand and said, My son was fined $1,200 last year because he put string lights on our back deck for his graduation party. I didn't fight it. I wish I had. Her voice cracked. Thank you, Mr. Callahan, for standing up when the rest of us were too afraid. I felt something shift inside me. Not pride, something deeper. Like a wound I hadn't realized I was carrying was finally starting to heal. When I finally did speak, I kept it short. I held up the letter Sylvia had sent me, the original $10,000 fine, and I said, "This is not how neighbors treat each other." Then I placed it on the table and walked out. The applause followed me to the parking lot. And when he asks me the one question I've already prepared for, "Why me, Mom? Why did she choose me?" I'll kneel down, look into those curious eyes, and tell him the only thing that makes sense. Because you're light, my love. And some people, when they see light, they want to own it. But no one can own you. No one ever will. Then I'll pull him into my arms, hold him like I did on the day he was returned to me, and remind myself for the 100th time that we made it. That no matter what darkness comes next, we already faced the worst, and came out the other side, whole.